Hello, everyone. My name is Colton Bernasol, and I'm a managing editor for The Bias, and I am here to chat with Jay Bergen, a pastor in the Mennonite Church and activist member of Mennonite Action. They are also a founder of No ICE Philly, a direct action organization that's doing a lot of organizing work around ICE today. I'm here to talk with them about their essay in our recently published print issue of The Bias. The essay is titled U.S. Christians Take Direct Action for Palestine Liberation. Jay, thanks so much for talking.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm wondering if we can begin our discussion with the TikTok videos that you're in. So the video shows a group of Mennonites and others being zip-tied in the U.S. Capitol building, and you were part of this. So could you tell me a bit about this moment, why you were there, and then what you were doing?
In January 2024, a few months after October 7th and after the Israeli genocide in Gaza began, I was part of direct action in the Capitol Rotunda, where over 100, mostly U.S. Mennonites, occupied the space and were singing hymns and praying together. I think most people's first image of a Mennonite, if you have one at all, is someone who's in plain dress, who, rides a horse and buggy, who maybe works on a farm. And there are certainly lots of Mennonites who look like that, but there are also lots of Mennonites who look like me and who interpret our faith tradition differently. And so in this moment where a bunch of us were called to witness and disrupt and take action there, following the example of groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, who had been a part of a very similar action they did a few months earlier. People see this and they say, oh, this is this group called Mennonite Action. Yes, they're carrying big quilts, and yes, they're singing in four-part harmony, these sort of symbols of traditional form of being Mennonite. But they're like, yeah, these couldn't possibly be Mennonites. They're willingly getting arrested. They're being disruptive in politics. Aren't Mennonites supposed to be the quiet in the land? Part of why I wanted to be a part of that action and why I wrote the article was this, wanting all of us to understand that when we take action as Christians, as followers of Jesus, whether or not we do it with other Christians or in ostensibly secular organizing projects, there's a history. We do this as part of a long and very broad tradition of followers of Jesus organizing in direct action and trying to enact a more just world.
There's so much there that I'd like to unpack in relationship to the origins of Mennonite Action, even thinking about the faith-based nature of the organizing that Mennonite Action is doing. What was it like for you and the group to do traditional Mennonite worship songs and pray in the Capitol?
We were all released from the Capitol Police custody, and we were debriefing. I think overwhelmingly, the feeling that people had in doing it was that it felt right, and then it felt like church. Sometimes when people of faith are taking action, it feels like we're sort of instrumentalizing parts of our tradition. We're dropping in a little language about God here or there. Some of that comes from maybe being uncomfortable talking about faith in a country where Christianity is such a reactionary force. But for those of us who sat in and sang, were arrested in the Capitol Rotunda, it felt right. It felt like we were doing church. There was this moment where the Capitol Police kept trying to arrest the person who was leading the singing in the hopes that would make us all stop singing. And as soon as they grabbed that person, somebody else stood up and started leading. And it really felt like an expression of a Mennonite tradition, the priesthood of all believers, that the whole community knows these songs. And even if they don't know this one song, maybe they know the next one and can lead that one. We got to do church even in the halls of power.
It seems people who identify as religious or faith-based or Christian is participating in social movements in two ways, so I'm sure there's more. On the one hand, you could be a person of faith who joins, an ostensibly secular movement, or at least in a movement that presents itself as secular, that doesn't use the language of faith. Or you could do the other route, which is to be kind of faith-based and faith-centered. So I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about the importance of really kind of faith-forward approaches to social movement building around particularly the genocide in Palestine. Maybe you could even talk about the origins of Mennonite Action.
It's really important to always remember that the genocide in Gaza is carried out by the Israeli government, but it could not happen without the U.S. government and without U.S. weapons, without U.S. money, and without U.S. ideology. And so much of what has driven the Israeli settler colonial project has been based on and grown in the United States, in our own tradition as a settler colony, in our own traditions of racial apartheid. And today, what we're seeing even more than ever is the weaponizing not only of our tax dollars, but also of our faith, right?
Mm.
That folks like Mike Huckabee and these other far-right Christians believe that it is their duty as followers of Jesus to support the mass murder of Palestinians. And the reasons for why they believe this are complex. There's geopolitical reasons, there's theological reasons about how much they want the world to end and the rapture to happen. But fundamentally, there are tens, maybe even hundreds of millions of Christians around this country who are looking at this theology, who are looking at the ways in which their faith is being weaponized, and they're saying, like, this isn't right. Right? This is not the Jesus that I know. The Jesus that I know is not paying for drones to massacre children in Gaza. It's not paying for the carpet bombing of cities. Like that's not who Jesus was, and that's not who Jesus is in our lives right now. And Mennonites have both a long-standing connection in Palestine, having done work in development and relief work in Palestine since 1948, and also a long-standing commitment to pacifism and to opposing war. I remember this moment, late fall, November 2023. My friend Nick Martin, who's an organizer in Pennsylvania, calls me, and he's like, hey, I think we should try to pull together a new project, a new organization of Mennonites to get people to take action as Mennonites against this bombing and the genocide in Gaza. What I said to him was no. I was like, we don't need another organization. There are other Mennonite groups that talk about Palestine. There are groups like JVP or U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights that Mennonites could join. I was like, listen, I'll support you, but I don't think it's necessary. So Nick and some others put out a call for people to join a mass Zoom call of this organization. Very quickly, they hit almost 1,000 people, and people all across the country were really excited about this. And I think one of the things that I realized in that is, first of all, there is this groundswell of people in churches all across the country who are looking at the far right misuse of our theology and our faith and are upset and angry about it. Second of all, that many of those people, whether we like it or not, are not going to engage in traditional activist spaces. You know, there have always been prominent and very visible groups of Christians in every anti-war movement in this country's history. And there are always people who don't identify as activists, who don't identify as, politically engaged people, as organizers. But when they are a part of a community that is successfully mobilized, they certainly do a lot of activism, and they certainly do a lot of organizing. You see this in any powerful and energized union, that people are like, oh, I'm not very political, but I will lead a delegation to go yell at my boss, or I will organize my coworkers for like a work stoppage or something. And it's like, okay, so when we can find those commonalities, even if we might wish for people to be activated purely by the horror of watching folks being murdered on social media, it often takes that close connection. And a lot of Mennonites share certain cultural markers, traditions, and a strong sense of community with each other. And so when the call went out for Mennonites to gather, first to plan distributed actions in cities, towns around the country, and then to converge in DC, Nick and others were right. They had the right moment and the right idea. I don't actually think it's necessarily better or worse. Go back to actually answer your question. I don't actually think it's better or worse for Christians to be organizing as Christians versus to just be Christians showing up in non-Christian organizing spaces. I think it's vitally important that we can do both. It's vitally important that we know how to meaningfully organize with people from other faith traditions, people of no faith tradition. And it's also vitally important that we know how to activate and mobilize our people and help our communities interpret and understand how our traditions call us to be people of peace, to be people of justice, and to be politically engaged.
In that regard, in your essay, you actually note 3 movements, which are faith-based and not faith-based, that inspired the direct action approach of Mennonite Action. So could you speak to those movements?
I talk about a few lineages that have influenced Mennonite Action, and then another project I helped found that came out of success of Mennonite Action, which is called Christians for Free Palestine, which is a broader umbrella for Christians, and has done a lot of work with seminarians and with progressive Christians across the country who maybe don't have quite the sort of denominational tie that Mennonites do. So the three different lineages that I talk about are the momentum organizing model, some of the internal processes and practices of Black Lives Matter, and then the legacy of the Pledge of Resistance and the organizing against U.S. imperial wars in Central America in the 1980s. Interestingly, all three of these movements have people of faith and followers of Jesus involved right from the get-go, and they are deeply intertwined with faith communities. Momentum organizing is not a faith-based organizing model. The sort of most prominent organization that they've helped launch is, of course, Sunrise Movement, but other groups like If Not Now and Gosecha, groups like Dream Defenders, are very influenced by sort of how they think about a theory of change, how they think about power and cultural organizing. But from the beginning, the folks who were helping theorize how do we mobilize people quickly and effectively and give them a really powerful sense of shared identity were folks coming out of Christian traditions and coming out of church. And similar with Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter gets a lot of negative comparisons to the Southern Freedom Movement in the 1950s and 60s, right? It's like, oh, well, back in the 60s, everybody went to church and then, Dr. King called you and you went out and marched, right? And Black Lives Matter isn't like that. It's all these kids who don't go to church. And, first of all, that fundamentally misunderstands the 50s and 60s and the young people who did so much of the organizing in the South, who were pretty cynical about church and who were pretty used to operating both in and outside of church spaces. And it also misunderstands just how much Black churches and other churches who've been in solidarity have been vital to the movement for Black lives. If you doubt this, do a search for works of theology about Black Lives Matter, and you'll find dozens of works from activist theologians, from scholars talking about the ways in which Black organizers utilize a bunch of different faith traditions and practices to create a movement that's sustainable, where people are caring for each other. And those practices of care and community building and conflict resolution, they ripple out into all sorts of organizing spaces. So Mennonite Action is a very white organizing space. Majority of Mennonites in the United States are white, though it's far more multiracial than you might think. Even those organizing practices get picked up by groups of Mennonites who want to figure out how do we take action and organize and be effective, but also care for each other. And then the third tradition is the anti-war tradition of the 1980s. And it's often a very overlooked tradition, right? We know about resistance to the Vietnam War. We know about resistance to the invasion of Iraq, but we don't think about as much, unless you were someone who was active in that movement, just how much Christians and people of faith under Reagan organized to prevent him from invading countries, and especially Nicaragua, Guatemala in the 1980s. And they did that through these mass mobilizing techniques that have been then adapted by groups like the Movement for Black Lives and Momentum, getting a bunch of people signed on, doing things like these very large public trainings to build alignment on tactics, and really using the language of faith and the traditions of faith communities as a part of actions to ground the people, to give us courage in doing really risky things, but also to make clear to the media, to outside observers, to the broader public that this is not a situation where the forces of war, the forces of imperialism and violence get to lay claim to our faith and to the tradition of Jesus. The tradition of Jesus calls us to be in the streets disrupting warmongering.
This third tradition, the anti-war movement, and really the faith-based side of it seems especially important right now, given the unapologetic turn toward war as the national identity. With the Democratic Party, they too supported the genocide in Palestine. So I'm wondering, what are your thoughts right now about, if not reviving, but bringing more attention to what this anti-war legacy offers to how we should be mobilizing today?
So I said earlier that when we think about anti-war movements in the U.S., we think first of Vietnam and then we think of Iraq. And those are interesting examples because they are two massive moments of mobilization and direct action and political organizing. And they are moments where support for public support for U.S. war making started out pretty high, right? Even though there was always a very widespread opposition to the invasion and the occupation of Iraq, like it took many, many years for the majority of Americans to actually oppose what the US government was doing there. And by contrast, right now, like the majority of Americans do not want to be at war with Iran, right? If power was actually purely about public opinion, then we would have won already. The situation wasn't quite the same in the 1980s, but organizers had a very similar issue, which was widespread public apathy. It's like, why do I care what the U.S. government may or may not be doing with the CIA in Central America, right? Like, I got problems closer to home. Reagan's tanked the economy, et cetera, et cetera. So in some ways, it feels like, oh, well, in Vietnam and Iraq, people were so successful at mobilizing, even though people weren't able to stop the invasion of Iraq, they made sort of further wars at the time against like Syria and Iran, like just completely politically unfeasible, and really like kneecapped the Bush administration's goal of just like waging war on everybody and their cousin. We have a little different problem that the elders in our anti-war movement who were organizers in the 80s were more familiar with. The tactic that they used there was a single shared pledge of resistance that they got thousands and thousands of people of faith and people of no faith around the country to sign saying, we agree on this red line. And if the US government crosses this red line, then we will take action. I think it's really important for organizers right now to be discerning what those red lines are, because the current administration is just running roughshod over every single one of them. And if we don't have shared analysis and shared agreement on like, okay, this is the marker at which we deploy, at which we, sort of break glass, then we're just going to keep descending the slope into fascism and authoritarianism. And naming that red line and building community and organizational agreement on this far but no further is not to say that like, well, that line is going to be where it stops, right? I think people often have this very cynical approach, like, oh, you can draw a red line, Trump's just going to walk over it. Yeah, he will. But the point is, we need agreement on, okay, if you do this, we will all commit to taking action in this way. That could be true with something like the war in Iran. It's hard to think about, what red lines in Gaza and Lebanon the US and Israeli forces have not already crossed. Mm-hmm. And so having a red line and a pledge of resistance is not a solution for every single organizing problem, but thinking about where we can build alignment for forms of creative action that are actually disruptive is really important. I think one thing that we saw pretty clearly in the last few years is how much the public opinion is not the same thing as power, is not the same thing as policy, and that both major political parties are very happy to ignore masses in the streets. They do so at their own detriment when it comes to election day, and we're seeing that in local elections all over the country right now, where progressives, where people who actually have a vision for what this country can be and who are actually opposed to U.S. war profiteering are winning all over the country. But that means we also have to think really creatively if we're going to continue to do direct action. ICE doesn't care if several thousand people are marching in the middle of the street. A several thousand person march can accomplish other things. It can build community, it can build alignment, it can build shared messaging. What ICE does care about is if you stop them from operating, if you block their vehicles, if you hinder their ability to cooperate with local police forces, if you prevent them from being able to build warehouses to send people. So the big protests that we've seen in the past few years and that are a part of every single anti-war movement can be really valuable, but they are most valuable when they're tied with really clear alignment and red lines, and then also these more bold and creative and unexpected forms of resistance.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, it does seem to me that the kind of mobilization that takes place in, say, like No Kings, these super large protests will go nowhere if they're not tied to other kinds of protesting acts and a broad-based vision of society and communities that we need to be. We need some version of a yes to something, not only a no. Mm-hmm. So this is a related question. It's been about 2 years, I think, since the Capitol protest. What do you think churches and faith-based activists need to do to sustain direct action, the Palestine movement?
First of all, there needs to be some space for us to grieve, to acknowledge the mass death of people in Gaza and in Lebanon continues. That even if it is no longer front and center on our news feeds every day, it continues to happen. And we have to say the ways that we've not been successful, that we've failed. Part of that then is some honest reflection about what has worked in terms of bringing together unlikely and surprising coalitions of people, what has been effective in terms of, the increasing number of US politicians who are willing to sign on to banning weapon sales to Israel, to really be willing to say,
especially in light of
what we're doing, and that part of learning is trying something new and trying something risky. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the solution is to do a more disruptive, a more confrontational, or a more intense form of action. When Trump won back in 2024, I know a lot of us were really trying to figure out, well, what does this even mean for political organizing? What does this mean for us as workers, as community members, as who are immigrants? What does this mean for us? What can we do? And I remember reading some reflections from organizers from the 1970s and 1980s saying that in these moments of crisis, you can choose to go really narrow and to this is sort of the Weather Underground approach. If a very small group of us can commit to being more and more radical, quote unquote, in our action, or we can think about how do we go really broad. And actually, sometimes going really broad is scarier because it means having lots and lots and lots of hard conversations with people and doing really boring things, just talking with lots of people, having lots of educational events, and saying we're trying to build for the long term. I think that's one of the things that Palestinians and Palestinian Americans have been reminding U.S. leftists of for the last several years is whether you've been in this fight for 2 years or 10 years or 20 years, Palestinians have been in this fight for 80 or 100. We have to always be learning and always have that humility about, okay, what am I doing that is working, that is serving to create a more just and a more peaceable world? And what am I doing that's not actually serving that, but it's just what feels familiar, what feels safe? That applies both to people for whom any form of protesting is scary, but it also applies to those of us who are yeah, I'll organize a direct action, I'll get myself arrested. It's well, there's a certain safety and familiarity in doing the thing that we know how to do. And we have to be willing to try something else.
Yeah, I study the theology of liberation in the Philippines during the period of the 70s and the 80s called the theology of struggle. And there's a theologian who I've been really influenced by. His name's Adicio de la Torre. He was imprisoned multiple times, organizing work among farmers, and particularly his kind of outspoken criticisms of the US-backed Marcos dictatorship during that period. He writes about the protracted nature of struggle. Marcos was elected in 1965. He declared martial law and kind of assumed total power in 1972. And he wasn't ousted until 1986. So that was an organizing movement that had both an underground and above ground sector. But that was 20 years worth of organizing. And that's given me hope, but also the realization of needing to think about long-term strategies for struggle. I want to close our conversation in recognition of the kind of sober realization that the struggle might be protracted. What is it that gives you hope today?
Thank you for that reference to the struggle in the Philippines and the reality of having to think generationally, right? I was just talking about the need for creativity and experimentation and stepping out of our comfort zones. And so much of what has given me hope in 2026 is the unbelievable number of people who are doing that, right? We got to witness a masterclass in creative experimentation in Minneapolis this year. I wish we didn't have to experience that, but every conversation I had with somebody in Minneapolis or somebody who went there as part of a delegation was a window into everyday people using the skills and the relationships they had, and then taking risk in a way that they never thought they were going to. And we've seen it with some of the anti-ICE organizing even here in Philly. Philly's been much less intensively targeted than a place like Minneapolis or Chicago where you're at. But the first time that we did an action actually blocking ICE vehicles at their office, we were all terrified. Going to get federal charges. It's going to go really badly. And it was really hard to get people to do it, right? People were scared. The second time we did it, it was a little less scary. And we were able to figure out a way to block the space for longer and prevent vehicles from going for even longer. And so then a few days later, I went to a group of folks from No Ice Philly. We said, okay, here we think are the risks. We're about to block the garage doors for a third time. If you do it the same way, here's what we think is going to happen. If you just go and stand in front of the vehicles and you sing, they will eventually push you out of the way. If you sit down, they will eventually arrest you. And the group talked about it for a while, and they're like, okay, well, how about we stand until they're ready, until they say they're going to start arresting us, and then we start leaving, and then we do a die-in. And I was like, oh, that's brilliant. And they showed up at the action with the names of people killed by ICE agents on their jackets, and it was Good Friday. So there were a group of clergy who were doing a prayer service unrelated to the blockade, like on the other side of the office. And as that group of clergy started singing, "Were you there when they laid him in the tomb?" These folks pivoted their action. The cops were going to move in to arrest them, and so they pulled back, and the cops said, oh, they're leaving. Okay, we'll back off. And then one by one, everybody just lay down in the street and shut the whole street down, and the ICE vehicles couldn't come in. They couldn't leave. And the clergy started gathering around them and praying and singing. And we had this standoff between like a dozen Methodists in their clergy gear and the riot cops, and they were able to block the space for close to another hour. Some of that people were able to creatively make happen by trying something new, by taking a different risk. And some of it's just the spirit, right? It's just, if I take a risk, if I try something new, if I am creative, like I'm trusting that God is going to be there and is going to make something happen that is beyond my understanding, beyond my capacity to orchestrate, that we can witness moments like that we can be a part of moments of incredible bravery and creativity right now is such an amazing gift. And it gives me so much hope to get to be a part of those and to bear witness to those.
That's an important place to end. Thanks so much for being willing to not only talk about your essay about Mennonite Action and the Palestine movement, but also to talk a little bit about its implications for today.
Thanks for having me. Congrats on the print publication.
Yeah, thank you.